What does it mean to be evangelical? What or who comes to mind when you hear that word? Is it televangelists, politicians, Billy Graham, maybe your own parents? Has evangelical become a dirty word? What's the history of American evangelicalism, and why are so many people divorcing themselves from the word and the culture? We'll be talking about all of that and much more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church. And before I introduce our guests, just a little reminder, Theology on Air is a ministry born out of Theology on Tap, where a bunch of young adults in Houston get together around craft beer and talk about fascinating ideas in philosophy and theology and the Bible and faith and culture. And we have a lot of fun. But in the podcast, we get to go a little bit deeper into some of those ideas and concepts. And so that is what we're doing today, although we're doing something a little bit different today. I'll tell you about in a second. But if you like us, show us some love on whatever platform you listen to podcasts, rate us, review us, tell your friends. Same thing goes for YouTube. You can subscribe. I'm not cool enough to have the little hit the bell here, but I think you guys can figure that out. So I am joined today by the beautiful and wonderful Meredith Mills, who is the senior pastor at Westminster United Methodist Church here in Houston. She's also the mastermind behind Gastro Church, which you'll have to ask her about another time, but it involves food and Jesus. So it's a pretty awesome ministry. And our guest today, I'm very excited about, is Dr. Grant Wacker. He is the Gilbert T. Rao Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Duke Divinity School, and now fully retired, as we can see in his background. Dr. Wacker has taught Christian history at UNC Chapel Hill and Duke Divinity School for 45 years, so he knows a thing or two. He has authored and co-authored several books, including Religion and American Life, and One Soul at a Time, the story of Billy Graham. So welcome to the show, Dr. Wacker. We're so pleased to have you with us. Let me explain a little bit of what we're doing today, and then I'm going to let Dr. Wacker just, share all of his knowledge with us. We have an event coming up. Our next live event is August 10th. You will hear this podcast before then, and it's going to be called Exvangelical, Why Some Walk Away, I think is what it's the subtitle. And the idea is to figure out why people are divorcing themselves from evangelicalism as we know it. What does it mean to deconstruct? Why does that happen? How does it happen? What does it mean? And so as we lead up to that, we thought it might be nice to define some of our terms and just kind of get all on the same page so that when we're at the live event, we're not all saying, well, when you say evangelical, you mean this. And when I say it, I mean that. So this is the first of 3 podcasts that are kind of extra bonus icing on the cake podcast that we're going to do. Do you want to say anything else about that, or shall I just jump in?
So the reason we started up with this one, with the question of what is an evangelical, I think is exactly, we didn't want to get to this event and all be talking crosswise. And a turning point for me in seminary was when I took my first American Christianity course and discovered that evangelical actually has a definition. I think growing up, I just thought of it as Christian, because I was in that subculture. And so actually being able to define what an evangelical is was a kind of a turning point for me. And so I somehow got my old seminary professor to come talk to us about it. And so that's how we got to this podcast that we are in today.
No, I love it. And even when Meredith and I were talking about this ahead of time, when we heard that word when we were little, we thought very different things.
Yeah.
I didn't realize until my postgraduate school years that some people didn't like the word evangelical. And then of course, fast forward when Trump called himself one, everyone lost their minds. Yeah. Maybe we'll talk about that. I don't know. But Dr. Wacker, what I would love before we kind of climb into all the definitions and everything is just to hear a little bit of your own story, like your own personal story of faith, how you came to know the Lord, and then, of course, what got your curiosity going about the church and religion in America. Tell us just a little bit about you.
That's a huge question.
It's like 14 questions in one, but you've got 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Well,
I mean,
Yeah, that's about right, because it's really not a terribly interesting story. But actually that's significant in itself. There are a lot of people like me, and so it's not an unusual story that makes for a lot of interest. I grew up in a little town in Southwest Missouri, and I grew up in a Pentecostal church and very much a Pentecostal subculture. And for that matter, we didn't like the word evangelical, or we didn't like evangelicals either, because we thought they were too far to the left. They had sold out in too many ways. So if you come from, you know, a perspective like that of Pentecostals or other smaller groups, then evangelicalism looks way too mainline. But I grew up in that subculture, and I went to the West Coast for college, and then on to New England for graduate school. And my first job was at the University of North Carolina, and I was there for 15 years. And then I began to look for a better basketball team. And so what else am I going to do? You know, just go across.
That's how all of our stories of faith go.
Yeah, that's where it all ends up. But I don't know, with Coach K retiring, I don't know what'll happen before long. Well, we have faith, right? We have faith that history will turn out well in the end. So that's my trajectory. Taught at UNC 15 years and at Duke for 30 years. I had loved it. Absolutely loved it. I love teaching in the divinity school and having a hand in the shaping and forming of divinity students who are going into the ministry, like Meredith. That was an honor, and I will always consider myself very grateful for that. And then I also taught in the graduate program and had the great privilege of training a bunch of graduate students who go out and teach the field. So that's my academic story. On the personal front, I have a wife and 2 kids and 5 grandkids, and absolutely overjoyed by all of that. And in terms of a faith pilgrimage, mine, I think, is quite typical of many, and that is I grew up in, as I said, an ultra conservative environment. And when I went to graduate, and when I went off to college, a secular college, that faith was battered, and it received a lot of blows, and it didn't crumble, but it certainly was weakened. And it's when I went to graduate school in the study of religion that it was even more weakened, and I began to find out that all religious traditions are in many ways a product of their time and place. And this is a blow when you grow up thinking that everything falls from the sky. And then you begin to see the historical conditioning. But somewhere in those years, I began to think that Christian faith is the best explanation. Best explanation for my life and for the world around me. And I came gradually to absorb that faith and to affirm it and to embrace it. And eventually we became United Methodists. And we've been United Methodists for a long time now, many years. My daughter is a United Methodist minister in Apex, North Carolina. So I'm not clergy, I'm lay. But that too is part of the tradition that I very much affirm. I call myself what I hope is a self-critical evangelical. I embrace the term. I won't let the barbarians take the term away from me. It's my term, my identity. But I hope I'm self-critical about it, and that I can see the flaws as well as the strengths in the tradition.
Well, that's a fantastic segue, actually, into getting into some of the actual historical part, which is why we're here. So to start us off, could you just briefly define, how would you define an American evangelical, rather than in terms of historical, first giving a definition of like, what would the characteristics of an American evangelical be? Do you think that's a good starting place?
Sure. No, I do. I think this is where we have to start. We have to have a sense of what we're looking for, when we look historically. And so we need to set out some kind of a framework. I would begin with a theological definition, and then I'll move to other ways of thinking about it. But to my mind, we get the most traction if we begin with a theological definition. And there be 4 points or 5 points of belief, things that evangelicals believe, things that they affirm. The first would be that they revere the Bible as a source of authority for all of the important questions of life. We going to look at many other sources of authority, newspapers, almanacs, whatever, but the final source of authority needs to be the Bible. Now, evangelicals have a range of views as to what that means, all the way from the Bible is an infallible guide to faith, or all the way to what's called inerrancy, the view that the Bible is factually accurate about everything that it affirms. But there's a whole range in there, but all of them would agree on the Bible as a final source of authority. A second would be emphasis on Christ and Christ's death and resurrection as core beliefs of Christianity. Unless you affirm those, you can't really claim to be an evangelical, or at least most evangelicals would say that. I mean, all kinds of people would affirm anything they want, but most evangelicals would say that one has to affirm the centrality of Jesus Christ and his death, atoning death, and resurrection, which provides an atonement for sin. That would be a second item of belief. A third item of belief is the necessity of a personal conversion. Now, again, that's going to take a range of views, all the way conversion to what way I think mine was a gradual embrace of faith as the only realistic way of seeing my life, explaining my life. But there are a great many evangelicals who never have a pinpoint conversion experience. I'll get to Billy Graham later on, and he's strongly identified with that definable conversion experience. But his wife, Ruth, never had a conversion experience. She said, I always understood myself as an evangelical. That's how I grew up as a Christian. I grew up as a Christian. And so that is understood. But core to conversion is repentance. We don't have Christianity, and we certainly don't have evangelical Christianity without a sense of repentance, that I've done some things wrong, and I've got to come to terms with that, and I have to present that to Christ. A fourth position, which the outside world doesn't often recognize, but it's there, and that is that belief in revering the Bible and belief in Christ and conversion really must lead to a life of moral purity and ethical concern. Now that's defined in all sorts of ways. Key sense there is that it's got to count. It has to mean something. You can't just take it and internalize it and say, here I am, I'm an evangelical, and nobody's going to know about this. It's just internal to me. It has to manifest itself in concrete works. And then a final criterion, I would say, is evangelicals always have a sense of mission. It's good news. The word evangelical etymologically means good news. And well, it's not good news unless you proclaim it. You got to tell it to somebody. Amen. And so there is a missionary sense. Now, sometimes that can just mean living a life that you think is a witness, and that'd be a minimalist definition. Far more common would be the sense that evangelicals support a missionary endeavor, explicit missionary endeavor, spread the gospel around the world, spread it to the rest of the culture. But the idea of just sort of hiding your faith, under the bed, I mean, that's alien to evangelical. So I would say revering the Bible, an affirmation about the nature of Christ, the necessity of conversion, the necessity of a moral life growing out of that, and then also a sense of mission to convey that message.
It's already so helpful.
This is fantastic. This is fantastic. So I think the second question would be, where did it come from? And I do want to give a word of clarification here, because even I remember back when I was in your class in seminary, I was in our study group, And there was so much confusion because, again, if you grew up evangelical, you didn't call it evangelical, you called it Christian, right? You're like, this is just, I'm just Christian. And there was so much confusion. And one guy raised a hand and said, aren't we all supposed to be evangelical? And because he's thinking about evangelical as a theological term. And what the precept said, or actually, I don't remember what they're called, the TA, the person said, he said, okay, there are all kinds of terms out there. When you do it, and when you put them in a lowercase, they are describing a theological term. When you put them in an uppercase, they're describing a particular group of people. So I am Catholic in that I believe I belong to the Universal Church. But if you put it in an uppercase C, I am not a member of the Roman Catholic Church, which is a particular institution. And he said, I am Orthodox in that I hold to ancient Christian beliefs with a lowercase o, but I am not a member of the Orthodox Christian Church with an uppercase o. And he said, the same is true with evangelicals. I am evangelical with a lowercase e in that I believe that in the good news, but I'm not necessarily big E, which is not just believing in the good news. It's a particular group within American Christianity. And Christianity is a bigger bubble than just evangelicalism. And so that was, I think, just getting people's minds around that evangelicalism is a particular group is helpful in some respects, and has a history within the United States, came from a particular trajectory of American Christianity. I wonder if the next step would be you saying a few words about where you think American evangelicalism especially originated from.
Yeah, good question. And I think your preceptor taught you well. A lot is gained by the uppercase and the lowercase. And one of the ironies here is that evangelicals themselves would often deny that. They would say there's only one kind of Christian that counts. And doesn't matter what uppercase, lowercase, if you're not evangelical, you're out. Okay. But looking at it in a more historical way, backing up a little bit, I think you're exactly right. And we can say this about all traditions, just as you said, Catholic and others. It matters a lot if we see it as a specific historical tradition, and I do. Where do we start? I would start it a discussion in the 18th century, the early 18th century, and put it in to the revivals that took place in England in the early 18th century, especially under the hand of John Wesley and his brother Charles Wesley. And John Wesley was a clergyman in the Church of England, but he moved in a direction that, in retrospect, we would see as evangelical. And he came to feel that the liturgy of the Church of England obscured what the heart of Christianity must be. The heart of Christianity must be a heartfelt embrace of Christ and Christian faith. The heart is central. You've got to embrace it. And we often quote Wesley as saying that in his own conversion experience, that he said, I felt my heart strangely warmed. Now, as it happens, Wesley only said that once. He never went back to that himself, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of evangelicals have picked up on that phrase, my heart strangely warmed. Very closely related to that is Charles, his brother, who was a songwriter, wrote more than 6,000 hymns. And I used to quip, you may remember, Meredith, I quipped the classes. If it weren't for Charles, we probably never would have heard of John. Charles was the great hymn writer. And Sunday after Sunday, people sing these great hymns, and that's how they internalize it. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great praise. You see, that's what brings it home. So it is the heart, understood in different ways. Then we move to the colonies, and there we have a somewhat different strain that feeds into this Wesleyan strain. It feeds in very easily. And there I would look to primarily preacher George Whitefield, spelled Whitefield, and to local preachers like Sarah Osborne. And let's take Whitefield. By any account, he was a fantastic preacher. He was charismatic. He was exciting. He brought people to faith by the thousands. Sarah Osborne was a local preacher in New England. And we often lose sight of the role of these local preachers, and particularly women, who spoke to smaller groups, but they helped solidify and cement that sense of commitment. What's important about Whitefield and Osborne is their stress upon the individual. They didn't say this, it's 20th century phrase, but I would attribute it to them. God has no grandchildren. Church doesn't matter. Each of us individually has to make a choice. And then that second word, choice. We choose Christ. It's an active individual choice. You don't become a Christian simply by birth in the church. All right. A 20th century evangelical preacher of some fame, Billy Sunday, says, being a member of a church doesn't make you a Christian any more than parking your car in a garage gives you a great running car. I mean, it takes individual choice. Well, that's a historical tradition. It's England and the American colonies, and these various streams come together. Then I'd go to the 19th century in the US, and evangelicalism began to take a different kind of shape in the US. And I would say that those theological streams stay similar. They don't change radically. But what does change radically is that evangelicalism begins to spread into the culture. Instead of being a minority religion, minority in the sense of statistical, it becomes a majority religion. It becomes the religion of the culture. And so evangelicals establish a benevolent empire. They reform. They try to reform society. But more ominously, evangelicals become deeply entwined in slavery. A minority of them, mostly in the North, and white and Black in the North, come to oppose slavery. In the South, the great majority of evangelicals affirm slavery as taught by the Bible. And this would be the overwhelming position of white evangelicals. The records are sparse, but what we know of the thinking of Black enslaved evangelicals would never have taken this position. So we get a racial divide as well as an ideological divide in the 19th century. So it spreads into the whole culture. Much of it takes on a reformist mode, changing the society, establishing asylums and orphanages and all of these things, but it also becomes entwined in the institution of slavery.
Can I just clarify one thing? When you're saying a reformist mood, you're not talking about the Reformed Church. You're talking about reforming the culture.
Absolutely. This is small r.
Yes.
Small r reform.
Yes.
And they established, let's say, what in the 19th century is called asylums for the insane. We today call it institutions for people with special needs. But in their view, this was a way of serving people who were not served in the church, or to a lesser extent, concern for, say, child labor. Some of them were pacifists, concerned for war. So a variety of social concerns they tried to address. But the overwhelming social issue that obscured everything else was enslavement. And how are they going to deal with that? And as I said, a minority of them opposed it, fought it. Many came to be known as abolitionists. A majority supported it, either implicitly or explicitly. And we find explicit support for slavery, especially in the South, but among whites. And so we have a racial divide here, which of course is not surprising. Now that's a 19th century shift. All right. Now we come into the 20th century, and some very important things happened to the tradition. it's risky to make a one-to-one correlation. I mean, in the very broadest sense, the conservative evangelicals of the 19th century, by conservative, I mean those who were at home with the institutions, at ease in Zion, including slavery, in general, they become conservative evangelicals of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, a name change takes place. And they're no longer known as conservative evangelicals, but they come to be known as fundamentalists. Why? Because they're affirming, as they see it, the fundamentals of Christian faith.
And at that point, that would not have been a negative term, right?
No, it was not.
Right. That was their self-definition of who they were.
Yeah, that was not a negative term. They were proud of it. They still are. Fundamentalists today are very proud of it. And what is important to see here is that they are affirming the fundamentals of Christian faith in the face of rising secularism. The mainline liberal church, which we haven't talked about, I mean, that's another story. The mainline liberal church had, in their view, given their heart to secularism, to evolution, to biblical criticism, to the looseness of secular culture. In the 1920s, they called it the flapper age. Okay. The mainline church had given in to secularism. So fundamentalists are affirming the fundamentals of the faith over against this sacrifice of the heart, the fundamentals of the church. Now, I think it would be unfair to, well, I think it'd be unfair to think that, to say that 20th century fundamentalists affirmed slavery. They did not, but they did. They were very comfortable with segregation. They were very comfortable with what today we call racism, the stratification of races. The other side of 19th century evangelicalism, the abolitionist side, the part that resisted slavery, the part that, say, supported pacifism and aid to the poor. Those were the people who in the 20th century then came to be known as evangelicals, or differently stated, they perpetuated the name. They retained the name that it always had in the 19th century. So they kept on, and it was this conservative group that had a different name. And this is a twist of history that journalists, bless their hearts, I mean, they often miss, that we go through a name change here, but it's a very important name change. So we have mainstream or more liberal evangelicals who like to think of themselves as mainstream, and then we have the old evangelicals, now known as fundamentalists. So when we come to the post-World War II era, we really have these two kinds of evangelicalism out there: fundamentalism and then historic evangelicals. Let's keep that name. Have to remember that there was also the mainline church over there somewhere on the proverbial left. So if we look at the landscape,
those sinners.
The what?
I'm joking. I said those sinners.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
just a joke.
Well,
joke.
With evangelicals, look, I mean, I grew up in a culture that said those people over on the mainline church, what do? Well, they sit in their sanctuaries on Sunday mornings and smoke.
Oh,
it's absurd.
Are sinners.
It's absurd. They didn't do that. Not that they, I mean, everybody is smoking, before the night.
Grant, can I just ask a quick clarifying question before you? I'm totally enraptured by this and I'm loving it. So I want you to keep going. But at this point in the game, do you think that both the fundamentalist and the historic evangelicalist would all espouse those sort of 5 characteristics you laid out at the beginning?
Absolutely.
Okay. So they're still in that camp, but there are some differences as far as maybe where culture is seeping in. Would you say that's kind of, you mentioned like evolution.
Where I talked about variations in each of those affirmations, this is where it becomes clear.
Okay.
Historic evangelicals, I like that term. Historic evangelicals, they tend not to get worried about these questions of inerrancy. Is the Bible true in every jot and tittle? They're far more concerned with, what Billy Graham would say, we'll get to Billy later, does the Bible infallibly bring us to faith? So you see, each of these questions begins to have a different kind of valence. Or when it comes to conversion, are we going to accept the kind of conversion I went through, a gradual race of faith as a way to live, as opposed to this kind of, pinpoint. So those are
Sure.
Now, the one thing that doesn't get modified is the emphasis upon resurrection of Christ. And there's very little budging. Turning the resurrection into some kind of metaphor about the Easter bunny, that just doesn't work. I mean, there has to be a miracle there. So some things are better adjusted than others. Okay, so we come to post World War II. So we've got this split: historic, like your terms there, historic evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And so they not only split, but there's a good deal of animosity. They don't really want to work together. But something else happens after, two things happen after World War II. And that is that evangelicalism begins to be politicized. Now, I'm using the term now in its old sense of embracing everybody. I'm not talking about those individual streams. I'm saying embracing everybody. It becomes politicized. And politics in the partisan sense, not in the sense that everybody has some kind of political view of the world, but rather it's in the partisan sense. They began to affirm certain kinds of political parties. And this is new. This does not happen in any, massive way before post-World War II, especially in the 1970s. And I would think it's fair to say the majority of evangelicals now, both fundamentalists and a big chunk of the historic evangelicals, become politically conservative. They're willing to affirm the Republican Party more often than not, again, with variations. I mean, it ranges all the way from what we might call Mitt Romney Republicans to far right Republicans, but they more often than not, they're going to affirm the conservative side of the political spectrum. There is a minority of evangelicals who do not do that. And the press often misses that. They've always been out there, and they're out there now.
They're among us. They walk among us.
They walk among us. Yeah. I mean, and they may not be Democrats. They may be independents, but in a variety of ways, they're liberals. And the press often misses there's this deep disjunction. Well, I said that's one big change that takes place after World War II. Now there's another change, and history can't be predicted. I mean, sociologists, many of them they're dear friends. Okay, but I have a problem. But one problem with sociology, it sees categories, and historians don't work with categories. We work with the particular. And the particular often creates surprises. And the great surprise, I would say, of post-World War II evangelicalism is an individual, one person named Billy Graham. And he's unpredictable. I mean, he grows up on a farm in North Carolina. He's absolutely an ordinary kid, ordinary grades, goes to an ordinary high school. And indeed, he makes C's and he flunks his math course. I mean, he's a very ordinary kid. But for a variety of reasons that historians have worked out, myself included, he begins to move out from the pack. It has to do with adventitious factors like his looks, his voice, the timbre of his voice, his command of scripture, his ability to schmooze. I mean, we don't often think of that as a character. I mean, he can schmooze with anybody. His ability to make friends with presidents of the United States. Later on, the ability of presidents of the United States to make friends with him. And that's a key. For all kinds of reasons that are non-predictable, but this one man comes to the fore. And one historian, a friend named George Marsden, said, after World War II, an evangelical can be defined as anyone who really likes Billy Graham. Okay. Or another journalist named Ken Woodward wrote in Newsweek, if you want to know where evangelicalism is going, watch where Billy Graham is going.
Mhm.
So there's
But
one.
at this, so I'm so sorry. But at this point, taking us back to our two kind of groups, what would the fundamentalists think about Billy Graham?
Wonderful question. To a significant extent, he held everything together.
Okay.
To a remarkable extent, he held it together. That said, he was not, I noticed I said remarkable extent. He didn't succeed totally.
Mhm.
And some fundamentalists just did not like his ability to associate with American presidents. They thought he was absolutely too acculturated. So Bob Jones, prominent fundamentalist who founds Bob Jones College, Bob Jones would say that Billy Graham is doing more damage to the cause of Jesus Christ than any person alive.
Jeez.
Now that's pretty
damning. Yeah.
And when Bob Jones died, his son, Bob Jones Jr., sent a letter to Billy Graham. He said, "You are not welcome at my father's funeral." So that's how deep. So Graham represented a lot of people. He represented almost all evangelicals and a fair number of fundamentalists, you know. But there was that core of fundamentalism that resisted and thought that he just sold out. All right. So we begin to see that politicization, but there's this countervailing force of this one individual who holds a lot of it together. And he keeps that politicization under control. He keeps people working together. So the politicization is there, but Graham resists it and he keeps things in a package until about the 1970s, when he begins to become quite elderly himself. My age, okay, for that matter. And he begins to lose control. And by the 70s, he's lost control. And so we see this diversification, this splitting. One more thing happens that's very important after World War II and then moving into the 21st century. Evangelicalism is, depending on your point of view, either intruded by or enriched by other traditions that flow into it. One of them is Pentecostalism, came to be known as a charismatic renewal, what I grew up in. And this was a more emotional expression of evangelicalism. And then not often recognized as the Roman Catholic tradition. A large minority of Catholics were and are effectively evangelical. They work together with evangelicals and they see that they have a common enemy, which is secularism.
I thought it'd be Satan, but you know, that's cool.
He is part of it. And notice
Yeah.
I turned Satan into a gender. He is part of it, okay. And that'd be part of it. But so Catholics and even people who are have a more ambiguous relationship, like conservative Mormons. But the key point is here, other traditions begin to feed into evangelicalism. So it becomes more of a kaleidoscope. And so going back to Merida's point about lowercase, uppercase, we began to have in some ways a lowercase where we have just a lot of people coming together, but not so much that we can't still talk about it as evangelicalism. So I think that's where we are today. It's an enormously diverse movement, more of a kaleidoscope, but there still is this deep divide. And some people remember Billy Graham, but there's nobody around today like a Billy Graham.
That was so much information in.
It was amazing.
That was extraordinary. Yeah. I just have like a million questions. Do we have questions from Facebook that we want to?
No, just people have been making comments, but no questions.
Okay, so I think, there are a million questions I want to get through, but I think the one that's on the top of my mind now is taking us a little bit more deeply into this moment. What's changed since Billy Graham died? So you've talked a little bit about there's been further fracturing. We've had more of a kaleidoscope. Can you say a little bit more? It does seem like the evangelicalism of Billy Graham is different than the evangelicalism of today.
Right.
At least I think so. And I wonder if you would agree and if you would say a few words about that.
I do. Graham was, especially in his later ministry, he's an irenic soul. He did not like controversy. He didn't like anybody to fight at all. He didn't fight. He never engaged in theological debates. He wanted everybody to get along. And when he left the scene, I mean, he didn't die until 2 years ago, but when his public presence began to erode in the 70s and the 80s, then those old currents that had the potential for conflict rose to the surface. I'm mixing metaphors here, but you understand the point is the old potential for conflict, which Graham suppressed, now becomes explicit. And so there is this conflict that's driven by politics, and then feeding into this. I mean, it's complicated. You take, charts and stuff, but feeding into this are these other traditions of Pentecostals and Catholics, but they get brought into, and they're part of the politicization and the animosity. So I'd say one change that we see is the internal diversification, and particularly the allying of people on two sides of a divide. What else is different?
Can I ask, do you think any of do you think the characteristics that you laid out of an evangelical would be different in 2021 than they were back in Wesley's day?
Yeah, there was not the political entanglement at all that we see today. I mean, Wesley would have scratched his head. Well, in fact, for that matter, Wesley was a strong opponent of slavery, the issues that were, and he opposed the American Revolution, for example. He thought this was just crazy. So the political ingredients were just different, but they weren't all that important. Today, they are.
Do you think Billy Graham actually led to the further politicization of evangelicalism, though? I mean, because Billy Graham, as friend of presidents, that was a huge part of his identity. I mean, do you think he helped fix the problem, or he helped create the problem?
Wonderful question. That's a very perceptive question. There has to be two answers to that, and that is which Billy Graham? Young Billy Graham or the mature Irenic?
That's true.
Young Billy Graham was partisan. He supported certain presidents, and he was very clear about that. He was unapologetic, particularly when he got to Nixon. He was unapologetic in supporting presidents, all right, and political parties. History sometimes turns on little events. A little event in this case was Watergate. It's a big event, but in one sense, it's a little event in that it deeply disillusioned Graham. When he read the Watergate tapes, he said, "I nearly vomited." And he changed at that point. That was a pivot point. And he said, "I have made a terrible mistake." And from there on, he tried to distance himself from partisan politics. So it makes a lot of difference. Are we talking about, say, a pre-Nixon Graham or a post-Nixon Graham? And the early Graham was pretty overt in his partisanship. The later Graham, now is clear where he stands. He's a moderate Republican all the way through. But he says politics doesn't belong in the pulpit. And he says Falwell and Pat Robertson, they're my friends personally. I play golf with them. But he said they bring politics into the pulpit. And he said more than that, I don't see much concern with poverty and with suffering and disease. I don't see these things in their preaching. And so he said, I don't want to see that in the pulpit. Now, the key question here is, did Billy Graham create the public space that political figures today fill? And the answer is yes, without question. So Graham's son is in many ways very conservative, not always, surprisingly, not always, but in many ways is extremely conservative. And people are constantly contrasting Franklin Graham with Billy Graham. And the difficulty with this is that, if you look at their explicit views, they're quite different. but the Father created the public space that the Son now fills. So the pre-Nixon Graham created that public space, and Billy didn't like what happened. He saw that he was responsible for something, but he couldn't take it back.
Right.
The deed is done.
So I wonder, thinking about, I just keep coming back to thinking about when we use the term evangelical today. And what's interesting about, so the picture that you just painted for us, evangelical was actually the more liberal of the terms, right? So it was the fundamentalists and the evangelicals, and the evangelicals were the, freewheeling ones that were interacting with the culture in a way that the fundamentalists weren't. And today, evangelical seems to, in many cases, has gotten
it's almost become synonymous with fundamentalism.
Yeah.
At least in people's minds, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's where you were going.
No, it's so for some people, it's still like a tried and true identity. For many people, even those who grew up in the church, it's now become a dirty word. Like, I'm not evangelical. The same way fundamentalism became a dirty word. I'm not fundamentalist, even though that was not necessarily originally designed to be a negative term at all.
Right.
And the same thing's happening with the evangelical term. And I'm wondering why. Like, what would be your read of why that's happening?
You're absolutely right, and it's just gotten just impossibly complicated in the last 20 years, and it's really difficult to talk about this. And as you know, Meredith, and talk about a classroom. It's why most courses in American religion stop at World War II, because we have no idea what happened afterwards, and we just sit back and say, what are we going to do? I mean, because these terms, yeah, but that's an important historical point in itself. The old labels don't work. Traditions get reshuffled. And this is just what happens in history. Thing gets reshuffled. All right, so we have to think about some of the reasons why it gets so complicated. One is we have to remember that much of the discussion works in terms of the assumption that evangelicalism is white. And a large minority of the tradition have always been constituted by Blacks, and a majority of Blacks today who are Christians are evangelical. So we have this stream that's really important. Now, politically, almost all African Americans are on the liberal side politically of the evangelical spectrum, politically, but not theologically. This is one of the things that gets
fascinating,
hard to parse. Black evangelicalism is theologically conservative, but politically liberal. All right, that's one. Latinos are now, since 1965 or the Hart-Sellers Act, we began to see significant Latino immigration involvement. And that is even more complicated because Latino evangelicals, Latinos break down, the slight majority are Roman Catholic, but a large minority are evangelicals. But they're not like Blacks. They're not as politically uniform. As we saw in the last election, a lot of Latinos affirmed Donald Trump. Does not mean they liked Donald Trump.
Such a churchy word. They affirmed him.
Even if they voted, but they would affirm Trump's views of abortion, for example.
Right.
So they're not exactly, we just can't talk about minorities as exactly the same, but still, the Latino strain makes things additionally complicated. And there is, you said you wanted to talk about attrition and people leaving, and all kinds of reasons why I think youth are disenchanted. They're disillusioned. There's a historian who talked about the disillusion of embittered love. And that's what often happens. Young people grow up in a tradition, but they become embittered by it. It has failed them. It's the God that failed in many cases. And so they begin to bail. Sometimes it's just a matter of terminology, but sometimes it's very substantive. They leave and they want nothing to do with it. And some go to an extreme and they commit their lives to combating what they saw, what they see as a pernicious evil in American life, but that's a minority. Most who leave, they just leave. They just drift away. And they're not in the pews. They're not paying tithes. good question. What happens with their children? We haven't gotten there yet. Do they have their kids baptized? Do they come back to the church with their kids? Well, we really don't know. So why are they alienated? I think part of it is the politicization. They don't like to see, like Billy Graham, they don't like to see politics in the pulpit. And sometimes that's on the left too. I mean, I will say that, and I, Meredith, far more often than not, when I heard sermons in Duke Chapel, and especially when they were preached by young folks, they were very political, but they were always on the left. It was the Democratic Party speaking from the pulpit. All right. You go out there in the Southern Baptist pulpit, it's going to be on the right. But either way, both ways, there's a lot of partisanship. All right. I think that alienates a lot of the younger people are looking for something more substantive theologically. That's part of it. Another part of it is the adequacy of secular explanations for everything. We don't really need the church anymore. We don't really need theologians to explain much anymore. Doesn't mean we don't need theologians, but we don't need their explanations so much because so much of it can be explained by modern science. I'm not sure if I was saying this back in the days that Meredith took my course, but we talked about the New York Times effect. And nowadays, New York Times never will look to a theological explanation from any trend. Now, what they might do is interview some theologian, say, well, what do you think? But it's always, kind of the tour through the zoo. And you notice how they always try to get one of everything. They get somebody on the right and somebody on the left. They interview Al Mohler on the right, and they find the dean of some university chapel on the left. So it's one of everything, but it's always compartmentalized. The New York Times approach: we have a secular explanation for everything. So I think politicization is part of it, and the adequacy of a scientific explanation for
seeming.
Yeah. So that actually leads me to another question I had, which so with the politicization of evangelicalism, like the press now loves to talk about evangelicals. It's just a common, especially if there's an evangelical who leaves the faith, like it's headline news everywhere, or if there's an evangelical who does something. And I wonder, like, what you think the press typically get right and what they get wrong when they're looking at evangelicalism.
Well, first, it's easy journalism. I didn't call it cheap journalism, but I'll say it's easy journalism.
Low-hanging fruit. Yeah.
It's a low-hanging fruit. You call up some local preacher. What do you think? So there it is. That's a great line. Low-hanging fruit. It's easy to write about a story if you've got an evangelical. Okay. And so I think often actually, I like journalists a lot. I mean, they call me a lot and they are friends, and I think they have a very hard job. I mean, they're writing about a theological issue one day and the Wilmington dock strike the next day. So, there's a lot of versatility that's required. So they're doing a hard job. And I admire many of them. And some of them are very astute. A person like David Brooks. Well, someone has said David Brooks is the most profound theologian in America today. Now, whatever you think of his politics, I mean, he thinks deeply about theological issues. Or Nicholas Kristof, who certainly is not an evangelical, but again, he thinks in theological terms. And so many of the journalists are astute observers of the culture. But to go back to Meredith's question, what do they get right and what do they get wrong? I think the fundamental issue that they get wrong is their depiction of evangelicals as what sociologists would call an independent variable in the elections. If you know what a person's religion is, and particularly if they're an evangelical, you know how they're going to vote.
Like a monolithic way of thinking about them. Is that
exactly. That they ascribe far more political power to evangelicals than they have. And I think there's a lot of evidence that if you know about the other features of a person's life, their race, their ethnicity, their location, their education, and so forth, if you know about the other features of their lives, you have a much better sense of how they're going to vote than if you know their religion. Religion, that doesn't mean it's irrelevant, but what it does mean is that it's a dependent variable. It fits into a lot of other factors. And very rarely do you find evangelicals working against their social location.
You know, I wonder, I think, I know we got to wrap this up pretty soon, but I have my last question that I really want to get to is, I have one too. Okay, yeah, we can, actually, I've got lots of questions. So however many times we have, when people, so Sarah and I have been binge listening to podcasts of people who have left the faith, and a lot of what they talk about is, some of it is theological, thinking about things that were taught. Some of it has far more to do with the culture, right? Evangelicalism has its own culture. It's got its own music. It's got its own food. You got to go to Chick-fil-A, right? It's got its own speakers. It's got its own television. It's got its own media. It's got its own everything. Like, you can exist within this subculture bubble.
A cocoon
your whole life if you want to. And I wonder if you could say a word to evangelicalism as a subculture. Like, has it always been like that, or did it develop that way as a kind of protective mechanism against secularization?
The short answer is no, it has not always been that way. And in fact, in the 19th century, it was the opposite. It was embedded in the great expanses of the culture. Or, as one historian put it, it was part of the great Gulf streams of American life broadly.
Right.
That's part of the reason they got into trouble over slavery, is that the majority of them gave their soul to slavery. The majority of white evangelicals, I have to stress. Okay. Lately, this cocoon effect is it's a post-World War II phenomenon, largely. And actually, this brings to mind the fact that a theological definition is not adequate. That's how I started, because I think overall that's the best one. But we can define the movement in other ways as a cultural definition. What kinds? These are people who eat at Chick-fil-A.
Yes.
These are
shop at Hobby Lobby.
Who listen or shop at Hobby Lobby.
Yeah.
Well, like, we go on and buy their clothes, and in certain places, there are all kinds of cultural earmarks that set them apart. Music, listen to distinctive music. I don't know that.
Dr. Wacker, do you have a fish on the back of your car? Is what we really want to know. He like, I'm so embarrassed by this.
I have to admit is that I've got a Blue Devil. Right. I have to admit that. But music, okay. Yeah. And one of the great elements of modern evangelicalism we haven't talked about, and I say it's a huge omission, is women. Is the role and place of women. Yep. One place where even liberal evangelicals have never gotten the message is on the subordination of women. But this is a dividing issue between the older generation and the younger generation. And I think more than race, more than ethnicity, more than abortion or the gay issues, it's how evangelicals are going to deal with the gender question that drives us. To my mind, I'm giving away my own theology and politics here. But I have a daughter who's a Methodist minister, okay? But what I think drives a spike in the heart of the movement, I'm mixing metaphors, but drives a spike in the heart of the movement is its resistance to its understanding to women is equal.
I've been keeping a list on my phone as I've been listening to people that would call themselves exvangelicals of reasons why they say they've left. And for sure, whether they call it complementarianism or whether they just call it misogyny or perceived misogyny, either in the Bible or in the church today, you're for sure right. I guess a question I would have for you is, when we think about modern day evangelicalism, when we think about it, we think about growing up with like televangelists, or maybe you mentioned like Pat Robertson and of course Billy Graham. I'm wondering who is in and who is out now. Like, who would be sort of a couple maybe modern voices that represent evangelicalism, sort of the modern Billy Grahams? I'm stealing Meredith's question.
There is no modern Billy Graham. There's no one close.
Yeah.
Now,
okay. Do you think there are a certain grouping? Is it the Gospel Coalition? Is it like?
Yeah, I mean, you have groups like the Gospel Coalition, but they don't have the kind of public power and visibility I mean, after all, Graham overnighted in the White House more often than any other person, including any other politician. He played golf with Richard Nixon more than 100 times. His bosom friend was Lyndon Johnson. I mean, there's a kind of a connection with the pinnacle of power that nobody comes close to having. I think today that we have to think in categories. There, if we think in categories, no one comes close to a Graham. But if we can think about people who have, say, a good deal of visibility. Rick Warren would be a person with a lot of visibility, and he's certainly become a liberal evangelical. He's on his work with AIDS in Africa, for example. Advocacy of women, Beth Moore. I think would be an example of someone who has a wide public traction.
Yeah.
Music, Hillsong. I don't know that much about music. And in some way, the Gaithers. Now, it's not as clear with the Gaithers.
Oh, for sure. No, I think you're right.
Gaithers.
So then the opposite of that question, or maybe the corollary, is who is now out? I mean, not counting obviously people that are not religious at all, atheists, agnostics, that kind of thing, but who would you say is outside of evangelicalism? So you talked about like the Pentecostal church thought that mainstream evangelicals were the big sinners that were just smoking in their churches. Right. Who now do you think would be, is it the same? Who would be the sort of Christians that are not evangelical?
So you're asking, like, is there still a fundamentalist evangelical divide? Is that,
but is there also something on the other side?
Oh,
Would
sure.
we say
Progressive churches. Yeah.
Progressive churches is where I was going with that, but I was
are there mainline Christians who are clearly evangelical? Is that the question?
Or who are not evangelical?
Yeah. Well, it's interestingly, there are, but they don't have the public visibility. Mm-hmm. And who shows up on, or at least Billy Graham showed up on the cover of Time magazine and Newsweek 32 times. Can you think of, well, Reinhold Niebuhr showed up on Time once, but can you think of mainline figures? The chaplain at Yale, Coffin, and William Sloane Coffin, he showed up once, but these are rare expressions of public visibility, but that doesn't really answer your question. I mean, who would I go to? I would have to think about it. And as soon as I come up with names, maybe someone like Barbara Brown Taylor, I don't know. She might say, well, in a lot of ways I am evangelical. Okay. And I don't see her so much that way, but I mean, the boundaries are porous, but she certainly isn't in the heart of the tradition.
Yeah. Well, and maybe it's a difficult question right now because there is so much of a movement to this place where you are still on Team Jesus is the term I like to use, but not calling yourself evangelical. And so it's everybody from the people that are just starting deconstruction, which you even described in your own personal pilgrimage, this idea of like feeling some tension and some woundedness and having to deal with that.
Battered,
yeah.
was the word.
But then of course, people that are all the way walking away is something.
Let me bring up just one name, Francis Collins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the most distinguished scientists, geneticists in the world. He's Catholic, but in many ways evangelical.
Yeah.
And this is where the boundaries blur. He's not known as evangelical. He's apolitical. He doesn't take a side in politics as far as I know. He gives the movement a kind of desperately needed credibility. And I think figures like that are underplayed. The press doesn't see that. It doesn't see Francis Collins.
One question. Okay, I have one more question. I realize that we're almost out of time, and this actually,
but go ahead.
This has nothing to do with our event, but something in your early definition caught me because this whole thing is a partnership between Methodist, Presbyterian, and Lutheran. So we like
and Episcopal and Baptist.
Yeah, but we rehash Calvin like every single time.
Oh, for sure. Meredith and I, it's like our favorite conversation.
Early on in your definition of evangelical, you said that one of the core things was making a decision for Christ, which decision theology would not align with Reformed theology. And yet so many of who we see as evangelical are currently like Reformed people. And so I'm wondering how that stacks up theologically.
See, but I heard you saying that a little bit differently. I heard you saying there's an individual aspect of saying yes to something rather than just being born into it.
Yeah.
So even I'm Reformed, but Meredith still loves me. Even I think there's choice involved.
It's because I was predestined to love you.
Oh, I'm so glad you're coming around.
But I think what he's saying is more than that. I think what he's saying is more than that. I think like you think about the Billy Graham Crusades and like the altar call and the make a decision today. Yep. And
I'm going to sing Just As I Am while you answer this question. If that's cool. I'm joking. I'm not going to do that.
I think even for people such as myself who cannot point to a pinpoint conversion, you still, at some point, you have to make a choice. Mm-hmm. And that is, where do my final loyalties lie? Do they lie with the New York Times, or do they lie with Scripture? And as much as possible, I would like to say, the Wall Street Journal, whatever. But I mean, do they lie with the secular explanation of life, or do they lie with the Book of Romans and Corinthians? Leviticus, not so much. Okay, but where does that final center of gravity lie? And I'm unhesitating about that. That's my choice, and all the time we have to make those kinds of choices. And maybe not all day, every day, but when you stop to think about it. And so there are choices.
Yeah.
No, I think that's actually a really good note to end on, because I mean we both agree that we at the end of the day we choose Scripture over the New York Times. And it makes me
that's
think
not a hard one, actually.
No,
or if you don't, you feel guilty about it. Okay.
Oh, so we're Catholic now. Oh, I'm joking. But it makes me think of Joshua saying, choose you this day who you're going to serve. Right. And we go back to Scripture and we want to serve and surrender to Christ. So, Dr. Wacker, this has been so interesting, at least for this theology nerd. I really appreciate you kind of building this up for us. And I wrote down the 5 characteristics. I think the fact you had 5 means maybe you're a closeted Calvinist. He's like the 5 points of the 5 solas.
He just talked about choice. He literally just gave
it.
I'm a Methodist, but at my heart of heart, I wish I were a Presbyterian. But they don't want me. They don't want me.
You know what? We're open to anybody. Come on, come on. Let me ask you this. If people want to follow up more with you, if they wanted to ask you some follow-up questions, where can people find you? Are you on social media, or do you have an email address that you'd be willing to give to people that?
Sure. Email. I don't do any social media. Don't do Facebook, Twitter. My granddaughter has to explain all this to me. She's extremely patronizing about it, I might add. And when I recently asked her what TikTok is, she just sighed. She said, I will explain this to you once. Okay, just once. Get it right. Okay. So I don't do any of that, but I do email. And it's simple, gwacker@duke.edu, just gwacker. And that gets me. Yeah.
That's great. And of course,
I love to receive emails. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. And of course, you guys can always reach out to Theology on Tap, Theology on Air, and we'll send you his way. But as far as our upcoming events, especially if this idea intrigues you, not just what evangelicalism is, but why people are walking away. What does that look like that they're walking away? Are they walking all the way away? Then definitely come and join us. If you're in Houston, August 10th is the event, Exvangelicals. We're going to be drinking some beer and talking about all of this. And then everything else you need to know about Houston Theology on Tap, you can find at houstontot.com. And so, of course, as always, between now and when we see you next, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.